Hello and welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy this story. I'm going to try and upload a new story each day. The Abandoned Asylum. Chapter 1. The Assignment. Holly Arnold sat at her cluttered desk, tapping her pen against a notepad filled with scribbled ideas. The newsroom was quiet, save for the distant hum of printers and the occasional ring of a phone. She was a seasoned journalist, known for her tenacity and courage, but this latest assignment felt different. Her editor had tossed it onto her desk with a casual shrug. Something for you to dig into. Holly Old Asylum on the Isle of Wight. Whitecroft Asylum closed down decades ago. Some rumors about experiments or something. Thought it might make a good piece. You know, the dark history of Whitecroft or something like that. Holly glanced at the folder. Beneath it, a faded photograph of the imposing building stared back at her. The asylum had been a topic of local legend for years, stories of hauntings and strange occurrences swirling around like the mist that often covered the isle. But those were just stories, at least. That's what she had always thought. Her curiosity piqued. Holly grabbed the folder and began flipping through the sparse contents. A few yellowed newspaper clippings, a handful of grainy black and white photographs, and a couple of pages of barely legible notes. The asylum had closed in the 1970s, the reasons for its shutdown unclear. Some said it was due to a lack of funding, others whispered about something darker experiments on the patients, things that the public was never meant to know. The more Holly read, the more intrigued she became. The clippings mentioned Dr. Walter Greaves, the head physician during the asylum's final years. He was described as brilliant but eccentric, known for his unconventional methods and obsession with curing mental illness at any cost. One article hinted at a scandal that erupted shortly before the asylum's closure, but the details were frustratingly vague. Holly decided there was only one way to uncover the truth. She would go to the Isle of Wight and see Whitecroft Asylum for herself. Chapter 2. Arrival. The ferry ride to the Isle of Wight was uneventful, the calm sea and overcast sky providing an almost serene backdrop. Holly's mind, however, was anything but serene. The closer she got to the island, the more a sense of unease crept into her thoughts. She told herself it was just nerves, the excitement of a new story, but deep down she knew it was something more. The Isle of Wight greeted her with its usual charm, quaint villages, rolling hills, and a sense of timelessness. But as she drove through the narrow roads leading to Whitecroft, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew heavy, the trees lining the road seemed to close in, and the sky darkened as thick clouds gathered above. When Holly finally arrived at the old asylum, she was struck by the sheer size of the building. Whitecroft loomed over her, its stone walls darkened with age, windows broken or boarded up. The once grand entrance was now a gaping maw, the wooden doors long since rotted away. The ground around the asylum were overgrown, the once manicured lawns now wild and tangled. She parked her car and stepped out, the crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound in the oppressive silence. Holly stared up at the building, a shiver running down her spine. The asylum seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if it were alive, watching her, waiting for her to enter. Shaking off the feeling, Holly grabbed her camera and notebook, heading toward the entrance. She had come this far. There was no turning back now. Chapter 3. The Asylum's Secrets. The inside of Whitecroft was even more decayed than the outside. The air was thick with the smell of mold and rot, and the floorboards creaked ominously with every step. Holly made her way through the main hall, her footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, and debris littered the floor, broken furniture, shattered glass, and scraps of paper that rustled as she walked by. Holly began taking photos, capturing the eerie atmosphere of the place. She could almost hear the echoes of the past, the distant murmurs of patients, the hurried footsteps of nurses, the sharp bark of orders from doctors. It was as if the asylum still held the memories of those who had once lived and suffered within its walls. As she ventured deeper into the building, Holly's unease grew. She found herself drawn to the lower levels of the asylum, where the most dangerous patients had been kept. The stairs leading down were steep and narrow, the air growing colder with each step she took. At the bottom she found a long corridor lined with heavy iron doors, each with a small, barred window. This was the isolation ward, where patients were locked away, forgotten by the world. Holly peered into one of the cells, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The room was small, barely enough space for a bed, which had long since decayed into a pile of rusted springs and tattered fabric. The walls were covered in strange markings, scratches, symbols, words that made no sense. She moved to the next cell and the next, each one more disturbing than the last. Some walls were smeared with dark stains that Holly didn't want to think too much about. Others had messages scrawled across them, pleas for help, incoherent ramblings, names repeated over and over again. It was in the last cell at the end of the corridor that Holly found something different. The door was ajar, creaking open with a push. Inside, the room was pristine and touched by time. The bed was intact, the walls clean, and on the floor was a single item, a leather-bound journal. Holly picked it up, her hands trembling slightly as she opened it. The pages were filled with the neat handwriting of Dr. Walter Greaves. Chapter 4: The Journal. The journal was a meticulous record of Dr. Greaves' work at Whitecroft, beginning with his arrival at the asylum and his initial observations of the patients. But as Holly read on, the tone of the entries began to shift. Greaves' writing became more frantic, more obsessed with his work. He wrote about his experiments, treatments designed to cure the patients of their illnesses. Electroshock therapy, lobotomies, drug trials, methods that were controversial even in their time. But Greaves took them further, pushing the boundaries of ethics and humanity. The journal detailed his attempts to rewire the human brain, to erase the madness that plagued his patients. He described in cold, clinical detail the procedures he performed, the effects they had on his subjects. But as the entries continued, it became clear that something had gone horribly wrong. Patients began to change, their minds fracturing in ways Greaves had not anticipated. Some became violent, others catatonic, trapped in a state between life and death. Greaves wrote of strange occurrences, patients speaking in tongues, their bodies contorting in unnatural ways. He documented the screams that echoed through the halls at night, the shadows that seemed to move on their own. The final entries were the most disturbing. Greaves described a breakthrough, a treatment that could potentially cure all mental illness. But it required a sacrifice, something he was willing to make. The last page was a single sentence, scrawled hastily across the paper. "They are coming for me." Holly's heart pounded in her chest as she closed the journal. She had uncovered the dark truth of Whitecroft, but it had come at a cost. The air around her seemed to grow colder, the shadows in the room deepening. She felt a presence, something watching her, drawing closer. With a sudden sense of urgency, Holly stuffed the journal into her bag and turned to leave. But as she stepped into the corridor, she froze. The iron doors that had been ajar were now closed, the sound of them slamming shut echoing through the hall. Panic surged through her as she ran for the stairs, but the air grew thick, as if the building itself was trying to stop her. The walls seemed to close in, the floor shifting beneath her feet. Holly's breaths came in ragged gasps as she stumbled, her flashlight flickering. She reached the staircase, only to find the way blocked by a figure standing at the top. It was a man, dressed in an old-fashioned doctor's coat, his face obscured by shadows. But Holly knew who it was: Dr. Walter Greaves. His voice echoed through the corridor, low and menacing. "You shouldn't have come here." Holly backed away, but the walls behind her seemed to pulse with a life of their own, trapping her. She was surrounded, the air thick with the presence of countless souls lost to the asylum's horrors. The shadows crept closer, whispering her name, reaching out with cold, spectral hands. In a final act of desperation, Holly pulled the journal from her bag and threw it at the figure. As it struck him, the room was plunged into darkness, the air filled with a deafening roar. Holly screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void. Chapter 5: The Aftermath. When Holly awoke, she was lying on the floor of the asylum's entrance hall. The building was silent, the oppressive atmosphere gone. She sat up, her body aching, her mind reeling from the ordeal. The journal was gone, as was any trace of Dr. Greaves or the horrors she had witnessed. Shakily, Holly made her way outside, the bright daylight almost blinding after the darkness of the asylum. The fresh air filled her lungs, a stark contrast to the heavy, decaying atmosphere she had just escaped. Holly stumbled to her car, her mind racing to piece together what had just happened. Was it real? Had she truly encountered Dr. Greaves, or had the asylum played tricks on her mind? She fumbled with her keys, finally managing to unlock the car and collapse into the driver's seat. Her hands trembled as she turned the ignition, the engine sputtering to life. Holly glanced back at the asylum one last time. The building stood silent, its dark windows staring back at her like empty eyes. It was as if the asylum was waiting, patient and malevolent, for the next soul foolish enough to cross its threshold. Shaking off the unease, Holly sped away, the tires kicking up gravel as she drove down the winding road. The further she got from Whitecroft, the lighter the air became, the clouds breaking apart to reveal patches of blue sky. But the dread lingered, a gnawing fear that something had followed her, something unseen clinging to the edges of her consciousness. By the time she reached her hotel, Holly was exhausted, both mentally and physically. She locked the door behind her, double-checking the bolt before collapsing onto the bed. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the dark corridors of the asylum, the shadows stretching out toward her, the figure of Dr. Greaves looming in the darkness. Finally, after what felt like hours, she drifted into a fitful sleep, haunted by dreams of the asylum, of its decayed halls and the tortured souls that lingered within. Chapter 6. Unfinished Business. Holly returned to London the next day, eager to put the experience behind her. But the asylum had left its mark on her. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the sense that something from Whitecroft had latched onto her. The bustling streets of the city felt claustrophobic, the noise overwhelming, and her once familiar apartment now felt foreign, as if it belonged to someone else. Days passed, and Holly threw herself into her work, trying to distract herself from the memories of the asylum. She pored over the notes and photos she had taken, but each time she tried to write the story, she hit a wall. The words wouldn't come, the images blurred in her mind, distorted by the trauma of what she had experienced. Then the nightmares began. Every night Holly found herself back in the asylum, wandering its endless corridors. The doors would slam shut behind her, the shadows creeping closer, and she would hear Dr. Greaves' voice, whispering her name, warning her to leave. But no matter how fast she ran, she could never escape. One morning, after waking from yet another nightmare, Holly made a decision. She had to return to Whitecroft. She had to find out what really happened, to confront whatever it was that had followed her back. She needed answers, and the only place she could find them was in the asylum itself. Chapter 7. The Return. Holly arrived back on the Isle of Wight under the cover of night, the moon hidden behind a thick layer of clouds. The drive to Whitecroft was eerily quiet, the roads deserted, the countryside shrouded in darkness. As she approached the asylum, the familiar dread settled in the pit of her stomach, but she forced herself to continue. The asylum loomed before her, just as imposing and terrifying as it had been the first time. Holly parked her car and stepped out, her breath visible in the cold night air. The building seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if it was aware of her presence, welcoming her back into its embrace. With a deep breath, Holly entered the asylum once more. The air inside was colder than she remembered, the silence deafening. She switched on her flashlight and made her way through the halls, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. This time Holly knew where she was going. She headed straight for the lower levels, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. The iron doors of the isolation ward were still closed, just as they had been when she left. She hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door to the last cell open. The room was exactly as she had left it, but there was something different, something wrong. The walls seemed to close in on her, the air thick with a foul odor. Holly's flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment the room was plunged into darkness. When the light returned, she saw it, a figure standing in the corner, shrouded in shadow. It was Dr. Greaves, but his face was twisted, distorted, his eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light. "You came back," he whispered. Holly took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you want?" she demanded. Dr. Greaves smiled, a cold, mirthless smile. "You have something that belongs to me." The journal, she had left it behind, or so she thought. But as she looked down, she realized it was in her hands, the leather cover worn and cracked. "You should have left," Greaves hissed. "But now, it's too late. You're part of this place. Just like the others, the walls around her began to pulse. Holly tried to move, to run, but her feet were rooted to the spot. The journal in her hands grew warm, then hot, burning her skin. Desperate, she threw the journal at Greaves, but it passed through him, landing on the floor with a dull thud. The room grew darker, the shadows closing in until Holly could barely see. She felt the cold grip of hands on her arms, pulling her down, dragging her into the darkness. Holly screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void. The last thing she saw was Dr. Greaves' face, twisted in a grotesque smile, as the darkness consumed her. Chapter 8: Legacy. Holly Arnold was never seen again. Her disappearance was a mystery that puzzled the local authorities and her colleagues back in London. The only clue was her abandoned car, found parked outside the ruins of Abandoned Asylum. Inside, the police found her notebook, filled with half-written notes about the asylum, and her camera, the last photos taken showing the interior of the building empty, silent, and still. But there was one photo that stood out, a photo that no one could explain. It showed Holly, standing in the isolation ward, her face pale and terrified, with the shadowy figure of Dr. Greaves standing behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder. The photo was the last entry in her story, a story that would never be told, locked away in the archives of forgotten histories. Whitecroft Asylum still stands on the Isle of Wight, a monument to the horrors of the past. The locals say the building is cursed, that it's a place where the walls still whisper, where the shadows are alive, and where the souls of the damned linger, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to step inside. And somewhere within its decaying walls, Holly Arnold remains, a part of the asylum's legacy, lost to the darkness, her story unfinished, her soul trapped in a place where the past never dies. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please don't forget to like, and even better, like and subscribe. Thank you very much, and I hope you have had or have a great day.